Welcome to the deep dive. You're probably here because you want to, really get to grips with complex topics, understand them properly.
Yeah, without getting bogged down.
Exactly. And today we're looking at something pretty significant, Rhett McLaughlin's journey away from his Christian faith. We have his stated reasons, basically, and we want to unpack them.
Uh-huh.
Our goal isn't about dismissing his personal story, not at all, but we do want to carefully examine the arguments he puts forward.
Right, looking at them through a lens of, well, Christian thought and reason, offering maybe some alternative ways to see things.
Think of it as trying to get a really clear perspective on why this shift happened, intellectually speaking.
Absolutely. It's about digging into the why. Whether you've had similar doubts yourself or maybe you're just interested in how people grapple with faith and reason, this should offer some clarity.
Hopefully some useful insights, too.
Yeah.
We want to move past just saying, I disagree, and really explore the arguments themselves.
Let's do it.
Okay, so first up, Rhett mentioned experiencing excessive certainty and spiritual pride in his Christian background. That was a trigger for him.
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction to make right off the bat. There's the ideal of Christian faith, and then there's how actual flawed people live it out. Christian faith talks about trust based on what it sees as evidence, scripture, testimony, reason, experience. But it also strongly warns against pride.
Oh, definitely. Proverbs 16.118, pride goes before destruction. James 4.6, God opposes the proud. It's right there in the text.
Exactly. So the very faith system he's critiquing actually condemns the kind of arrogance he might have observed. It's a crucial point.
So the issue wasn't maybe the faith itself, but the human failing. A specific subculture, perhaps.
Precisely. It's like blaming the car for a bad driver. The failure isn't inherent in the system, but in its misuse. Christian faith actually calls for humility, acknowledging God's mystery.
So having sufficient reason to believe doesn't have to mean arrogant overconfidence.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, Rhett's swing towards radical uncertainty could be seen as, well, an overcorrection from that experience.
Interesting. Have you ever seen that tension yourself between confident belief and genuine humility? It's a fine line sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. It's a constant challenge within any community of faith.
Okay, moving on. He also struggled with predestination, found it hard, theologically, said it made God seem, I think his words were, an asshole.
Right. And that's a common emotional reaction, but the key thing theologically is that he seems to be zeroing in on one specific, maybe quite stark interpretation, often called hard Calvinism.
But that's not the only view out there, is it?
Not by a long shot. Christianity has a huge range of perspectives on this. You've got Arminianism, which really emphasizes free will and salvation. Then there's Molinism, open theism, even softer takes on Calvinism itself.
So finding one view difficult doesn't automatically sink the whole ship.
Exactly. His personal, emotional, or even logical struggle with that one specific interpretation, while we can understand it, doesn't really refute how other Christians understand the doctrine.
How they reconcile it with God's justice, wisdom, things like that.
Yes. Within their own theological frameworks, these views make sense, often emphasizing God's sovereignty alongside human responsibility, or dealing with the profound nature of sin-deserving judgment.
It also touches on the idea of mystery in theology, doesn't it? That maybe we can't fully grasp how divine sovereignty and free will perfectly fit together.
That's a big part of it for many traditions. So rejecting all Christian thought on this because of difficulty with one specific flavor of it, well, it doesn't quite hold up logically.
Okay. What about the problem of hell? He mentioned finding the traditional view difficult and initially leaned towards annihilationism, the idea that the wicked are just destroyed, not eternally tormented.
Yeah, and what's revealing there is that at that point, he was still looking for answers within a broadly Christian framework. He wasn't rejecting it outright yet.
Right, trying to modify it, make it more palatable, perhaps.
Maybe. And again, just like with predestination, there's diversity here. The traditional view often frames hell as sort of the natural outcome of choosing separation from God, respecting free will, even to that extreme end.
But annihilationism is a view held by some Christians.
It is, and there are also universalist hopes within Christianity, the idea or hope that ultimately everyone might be reconciled to God. So these aren't necessarily just modern rebrandings.
They're attempts to wrestle with the concepts of justice, love, and free will within the tradition itself.
Exactly. They have theological grounding. So his initial move towards annihilationism shows he was engaging with that internal diversity, not just hitting a brick wall immediately. His later departure seems linked to a broader discomfort rather than dismantling every possible Christian view on the afterlife.
Got it. Okay, next big one. Science and faith. Specifically, evolution. He felt there was a conflict, especially because the anti-evolution arguments he heard didn't hold water for him.
Ah, yes. This is a classic one. And often it stems from what philosophers might call a category error,
Right.
meaning pitting a very specific literalistic reading of Genesis 1 against the findings of evolutionary biology. It sets up an unnecessary conflict.
Because many Christians don't see a conflict.
Exactly. Many Christians, including many scientists, absolutely accept evolution. They might hold a view like theistic evolution God as the ultimate creator, using evolutionary processes as the means.
So science describes the how, and faith addresses the why and the by whom.
Precisely. Science answers scientific questions, theology answers theological ones. When Rhett found the specific anti-evolution apologetics unconvincing, and frankly, some of them are quite weak, that doesn't logically mean all of Christianity crumbles.
Right. He generalized from the failure of one specific stance, maybe held strongly in his background, to the whole faith.
It seems that way. It's an overgeneralization. There are robust ways to integrate mainstream science and Christian belief that don't require rejecting evolution or, say, an ancient Earth. His experience doesn't negate those other perspectives.
Okay. He also had a critique of Christian apologetics itself, the methodology. He suggested it just works backward from a conclusion without real interest in, quote, what actually happened.
Yeah, I've heard that criticism,
Yeah.
but I think it often misunderstands what apologetics aims to do. It's about providing reasons for belief.
So not just starting with Christianity is true and then cherry-picking evidence.
Good apologetics shouldn't be doing that. It often involves reasoning towards Christian claims. Think about philosophical arguments for God's existence, or historical arguments for the resurrection based on evidence like the empty tomb, eyewitness accounts, the rise of the church.
So it can be an evidence-based process.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Faith involves commitment, yes, but that doesn't mean it has to shut down rational investigation. Many great Christian thinkers were also great philosophers and logicians.
What about the idea that apologists are inherently biased, unlike objective scholars?
Well, that sets up a bit of a false dichotomy, doesn't it? Everyone has presuppositions. An apologist believes Christianity is true, sure. But a skeptical scholar might approach the Bible with an a priori assumption that miracles are impossible. That's also a bias, a philosophical one.
So bias exists everywhere. The question is how it's handled.
Exactly. Good scholarship, whether theological or secular, acknowledges its starting points and engages with the evidence rigorously. Dismissing all apologetics as inherently biased is, well, it's too simplistic.
Okay. Then there were his issues with the Bible itself, historicity, interpretation. He adopted a more skeptical stance, influenced by historical critical methods.
Right. And a key thing here is appreciating genre. The Bible isn't just one book. It's a library. It has poetry, law, prophecy, letters, and historical narratives.
So reading, say, the Psalms the same way you read the Gospel of Luke would be a mistake.
The big mistake. Recognizing that some parts might use metaphor or allegory doesn't automatically undermine the historical claims made elsewhere, particularly in the Gospels and Acts concerning Jesus in the early church.
And there are arguments for the reliability of those historical claims.
Oh, definitely. Strong ones. Scholars look at criteria like eyewitness testimony, early creedal formulations that predate the letters, the sheer unlikelihood of the disciples inventing a resurrection story they died for, the empty tomb evidence, the rapid growth of the church. These aren't easily dismissed.
What about inconsistencies or variations between the Gospels? Skeptics often point to those.
Sure, and those are worth examining. But variations don't automatically equal contradiction or fabrication. Think of 4 witnesses to a car crash. They'll likely have slightly different perspectives, emphasize different details, remember things slightly differently.
Reflecting their different viewpoints or maybe who they were talking to.
Exactly. Different audiences, different theological emphasis.
Yeah.
Matthew might highlight Jesus' kingship for a Jewish audience, while Luke emphasizes his universal appeal. These differences can actually add to the richness and credibility, rather than detracting, if understood properly.
And perhaps there's an issue of applying an unfair standard of proof.
I think so, sometimes. We often don't demand the same level of absolute scientific-style proof from other ancient historical documents. There seems to be a special skepticism reserved for the Bible, perhaps driven by its religious claims.
Okay, another comparison he made was between Christian claims and Mormon claims, implying a double standard in how they're scrutinized.
Yeah, this comes up sometimes. But the comparison often breaks down when you look closely at the nature of the claims and the quality of the evidence.
How so?
Well, core Christian claims, Jesus' life, death, resurrection, are rooted in public events in the first century. We have multiple relatively early written sources, archaeological context, non-Christian sources mentioning Jesus. It's stuff historians can actually investigate, whether they believe the supernatural element or not.
And Mormonism.
Its foundational claims, like Joseph Smith's visions, the golden plates, rely heavily on private subjective experiences and artifacts, for which there's, well, a lack of external corroborating evidence from archaeology or non-Mormon history of the time.
So the kind of evidence is fundamentally different.
Fundamentally different.
Yeah.
Therefore, applying different levels of scrutiny or asking different kinds of questions isn't necessarily a biased double standard. It's just applying appropriate methodology based on the type of claim being made.
It's about evaluating the evidence on its own merits for each case.
Precisely. You wouldn't evaluate a scientific claim the same way you evaluate a historical one or a philosophical one. Same principle applies here.
Got it. Now, this is a really tough one for many people. The moral problems in the Bible, like the Canaanite conquest, Rhett viewed this through, understandably, a modern moral lens and found it deeply troubling.
Understandably, yes. These are genuinely difficult passages.
Yeah.
But the crucial first step is trying to understand them in their own context, ancient Near Eastern culture, and the specific theological framework of the Old Testament.
Not just imposing our 21st century values directly onto it.
Right. Within the text itself, this isn't presented as, say, simple ethnic cleansing or random violence. It's framed as a specific, targeted, and long-delayed divine judgment.
Delayed.
Yeah, think back to Genesis 15. God tells Abraham his descendants will return after 400 years because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. The text portrays God as patient, acting only after these cultures reached a profound level of wickedness. The text mentions things like child sacrifice.
So Israel is seen as an instrument of divine justice in that specific context.
That's the internal logic of the text. It involves grappling with difficult concepts: divine sovereignty, judgment, holiness, corporate sin within that specific covenantal history. It's radically different from our modern liberal democratic framework.
So dismissing it just because it clashes with our modern sensibilities might miss the whole point the text is trying to make, however difficult that point is.
It risks anachronism, yeah. It doesn't mean we shouldn't wrestle with it morally, but we need to wrestle with what the text is actually claiming first in its own world.
Okay. Lastly, Rhett pointed to the misuse of Jesus' name in teachings, particularly in politics, things like Christian nationalism. He saw this as a problem with Christianity.
And he's right that the misuse happens, and it is a problem, but there's a critical distinction to make here.
Which is?
The distinction between the actions or hypocrisy of followers and the validity of the faith itself. Criticizing how some people misuse Jesus' name is not the same as refuting Jesus' actual teachings or the core tenets of Christianity.
It's the fallacy of, judging a philosophy by its worst adherents.
Exactly. In fact, Christianity itself critiques this kind of hypocrisy very strongly. Jesus had his harshest words for religious leaders who didn't practice what they preached. Remember Matthew 7, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven."
Right. So pointing out the misuse actually aligns with Jesus' own message in a way.
It does. The failures of Christians are failures to live up to the standard, not proof that the standard itself is wrong.
So stepping back and looking at all these points together, what are some potential underlying patterns or maybe methodological issues in Rhett's approach from this analytical perspective?
Well, a few things seem to emerge. There's definitely that potential for overgeneralization, taking a bad experience in one part of Christianity and applying it to the whole thing, like the science issue or maybe the apologetics critique.
Okay, what else?
Perhaps an appeal to emotion or personal incredulity. Finding something difficult to understand or emotionally troubling, like predestination or hell, seems to lead towards rejecting it, rather than necessarily refuting it logically within its own framework. There might be an element of confirmation bias creeping in later, focusing on evidence that confirms his developing doubts. And maybe an inconsistent application of skepticism, high scrutiny for biblical claims, perhaps less scrutiny for the assumptions of historical criticism or naturalism itself.
And the anachronism we talked about with the Canaanite issue, applying modern standards inappropriately.
Yes, that too. And maybe not fully grappling with the internal coherence or the diversity within Christian thought on many of these issues. Conflating the flaws of believers with flaws in the belief system itself is another big one.
So if we were to try and characterize his deconstruction journey overall,
From this perspective, it looks less like a purely objective, rigorous quest that definitively disproved Christianity, and more like a personal journey. A journey driven by understandable discomforts and challenges encountered within a specific kind of evangelical context he was part of.
One that maybe didn't equip him well for some of these intellectual or emotional hurdles?
Possibly. It seems like a narrative of losing personal belief, because his initial framework couldn't adequately address his questions, combined with an increasing adoption of more secular or naturalistic assumptions about reality.
So rather than a refutation of core Christian claims across the board, it's more like a departure from a particular expression of Christianity that stopped making sense to him.
That seems a fair way to put it. It documents his loss of faith, shaped by his experiences and evolving worldview, more than it offers a universally compelling case against Christianity itself.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Rhett McLaughlin's deconstruction arguments, we've really tried to go point by point, look at the reasoning, and offer some alternative perspectives from within Christian thought.
Yeah, and the main takeaway for you, the listener, is hopefully the importance of nuance. Recognizing that these are complex issues, that there's often a lot of diversity within a religious tradition, and how crucial it is to examine our own assumptions when we evaluate these things.
And remembering that distinction between someone's personal experience, which is valid as experience, and the broader intellectual or theological claims of a belief system.
Absolutely crucial.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Journeys like Rhett's, while deeply personal, can actually push all of us to think harder. What are the hidden assumptions shaping our own views, whether religious or secular? Are we really open to perspectives that challenge us?
And what does count as sufficient reason for belief or for disbelief? How much do our emotions, our background, our experiences factor into that calculation? It's worth reflecting on.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.